Our mission, and we choose to accept it, is zero injuries and zero environmental impact. A healthy workforce and environment is key to our nation's continued success. The Mission Zero podcast is a deep dive with the industry's top experts into the health, safety, and environmental aspects of today's workplace. Our mission is to be a platform for new ideas and strategies that, when implemented, will improve our safety, our environment, and how we govern out business. We are making the world safer, and we're going to have fun doing it.
Okay, welcome everybody. This is a new edition of the Mission Zero podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Peoples. I have with me today my co-host, as always, Justin Overstreet. Welcome, Justin.
Glad to be here.
And a very special guest we have today, astronaut, speaker, podcaster, photographer, filmmaker, and author, Terry Virts. Terry, thank you so much for coming on today for us.
Hey, thanks for having me on. It's fun.
It's really great to have you. I appreciate your time so much. Generally, with our guests, what we like to do is kind of start out by giving them a little, or them giving us a little bit of their history, their career, what brought them to where they are today in the world, and what you're doing right now. Can you give us a little history? Maybe the moment you decided you wanted to be an astronaut till all the way through the space station.
Sure. When I was a kid, the first book I ever read was about Apollo. It was one of those kindergarten cardboard books. And I was hooked. You know, I was like, man, that sounds like a lot of fun getting to go to the moon. So I kind of spent my childhood fascinated about space. I had posters of galaxies and spaceships and all kinds of stuff covering the walls of my boyhood room. I didn't really know exactly how to make that happen. And then when I was in high school, a family friend told me to read The Right Stuff, which I did. It was an incredible book, just the best book. The movie's pretty good too. The movie has aged very well.
That's a Chuck Yeager
it showed me the path. It is. Yeah,
Okay.
Chuck Yeager and the original Mercury astronauts.
Okay, go ahead.
So those guys were fighter pilots and test pilots. So I kind of pursued that path. I went to the Air Force Academy, got a degree in math and also a minor in French, which is kind of a weird background or weird, combination. And then went to be a pilot in the Air Force, flew F-16s for the better part of a decade, ended up at test pilot school. And then I was picked by NASA really, actually pretty young. I was the youngest pilot they had, only spent about a year as a test pilot and spent 16 years at NASA, ended up flying on the Space Shuttle Endeavour for the final space station assembly mission. And then about 5 years later, I went back up on a Russian Soyuz to fly on a long duration space station flight. And I ended up spending over 7 months in space total. Left NASA now about 5 years ago. And I'm interested in writing and filmmaking. And that's kind of one of my passions. And my other passion is business and entrepreneurship, and energy is kind of my favorite thing. It's what makes the earth go round. So I have been involved in the energy industry for the last few years. I've got a startup renewable diesel company, and also I'm doing some part-time consulting for energy transition for some traditional oil and gas companies that are kind of branching out into the renewable universe.
Okay, great. Well, I guess, being in space gives you a few more hours every day somehow for you to be able to squeeze all of those things in. Well, so how many languages do you speak?
Well, I was Russian and French to varying levels. French I do pretty good in. Russian's a little bit tougher, but I can understand a little bit. I can get along in Russian. And I lived in Germany for years, so I picked up a few words in German. I never had any lessons. And of course, I live here in Texas now, so I've learned some Spanish over the years. Go eat at Mexican restaurants and so on, but mostly just French and Russian.
Were you stationed over in Germany?
Yeah, I spent probably the best years of my life there. 3.5 years based in Germany. A lot of that time was in Iraq. But my actual address was in Germany.
So my wife is Air Force, and she spent I think 2 years at Ramstein, and she loved it over there. She said when she first got her assignment, she was a Texas girl, so she got it in San Antonio, and she's trying to stay here, so she's trying to trade with people, and they wouldn't trade. And finally, someone took her aside and said, stop doing that. You'll regret it. And she would tell you today that if she had gotten her trade, she would have certainly regretted missing that. So
they were right. Yeah.
Germany's
amazing.
cool.
Yeah. I love it.
So, Terry, we'll just jump right into, start out with talking a little bit about space travel. Like I said, this is a health and safety issued podcast. What is space travel like on your body? What are the risks there? I guess, also the speed of travel, but also the risks on the body of being at zero gravity for that long of a time. What are the risks there?
So we're still learning. The biggest risk is probably blowing up during launch or landing. That's a hazard.
It seems like a big one.
Yeah, that's a hazard. But then once you get into space, like you said, you're weightless, and so that entails its own issues. There's been a lot of studies on astronaut eyes because a few guys have had problems with their eyesight. It changes blood flow and cardiovascular issues. It also puts a lot of pressure on your brain, and also you're breathing this really high carbon dioxide atmosphere. On Earth, we have trees and plants, and they work really good for taking CO2 out of the air. In space, we don't have that, and the machines we use to do that instead are just not as good as trees and plants. So that is, there's kind of an unknown effect that has. But by far the biggest problem is radiation and the potential for getting cancer from that. And I could actually see, I remember my 5th night in space, I closed my eyes, I was going to bed, and I saw this giant white flash, and it was radiation hitting my face. And actually, I remember going, my face is bleeding. So I don't know if you can probably see that right now. Mm-hmm. This is my skin cancer treatment that I've been doing for the past week. So, and it's just started bleeding, and I was like, what's going on? And then I went back 5 years later. Yeah, 5 years later, I'm back and had some more. I've got a bunch of scars on my chest and stuff. So it's okay. I get treated for it, but the radiation and cancer is definitely one of the risks. It's the big risk especially if we're going to go to Mars or anywhere deep space. When you're in low Earth orbit, you have some protection from the Earth's magnetic field. But when you go out in deep space, you don't have that. So going to the moon or Mars or others, the radiation environment is a lot worse. So that's one of the things that we really need to be aware of.
Well, we're definitely going to get to Mars. I met an astronaut. You're actually the second astronaut that I've met personally. One gentleman had told me he got all the time in space. He was now 2 inches taller. Is that a real thing?
Well, while you're in space, that's true. You grow a few inches. I was finally 6 feet tall, but then the doctors told me as soon as I came back to Earth, a couple hours later, I was back down to 5'10". So
is that because of the decompressive nature of weightlessness and all of that, or?
Yeah, right now gravity's pushing us all down, but sure. if you could sit up straight. So in space, it's like basically sitting up straight. You don't have gravity pushing down. You can just do that. My first flight, I didn't notice. On my second flight, it was painful, man. My back hurt pretty bad for like 2 weeks. They had this little thing that would stretch your body. That was a big help. But yeah, I had a lot of back pain on that flight.
I found it real interesting, going back and doing some research and listening to some other interviews you'd given. Yeah, the discussion around bone density loss up there and how you guys solved that issue.
Yeah, that's been something, for years. Bone density, it's basically like getting osteoporosis, because right now, even though we're all sitting there, we're still fighting, we're fighting gravity. So our bones and muscles are working. And in space, that doesn't happen at all because you're weightless. So they found it was just a linear decrease in bone density, about 1.5% a month. So in theory, if you were up there for a few years, you would turn into a jellyfish with no bones.
Right. They would just dissolve. Yeah.
Yeah. NASA came up with this exercise protocol that's really good. So I took a vitamin D tablet every day, because on Earth, you get that from sun. In space, you don't get that. So a vitamin D tablet every day and 2.5 hours of exercise. And after 200 days, I lost 0.0% of my bone density.
Oh, that's great.
Which shocked me. It shocked the doctors too. Normally, astronauts lose a little bit, but I was really diligent. I did my exercise every day.
You say 2.5 hours every day?
Well, that includes like getting cleaned up time, but they block out 2.5 hours out of your day to an hour for cardio, either a treadmill or bike, and then an hour and a half on the weightlifting machine. The weightlifting machine is what really did it. So I always tell, whenever I give a talk about this, I always tell, especially the women, grab a 5-pound dumbbell, grab a 10-pound dumbbell, and just do something. It's the resistive weightlifting that keeps your bone density strong, and that could prevent osteoporosis. So that's a disease that mostly women get. And so even a small amount of body weight exercise or 10 or 5-pound dumbbell exercise might really help out in the long run.
So it's interesting you bring that up, that it affects women more drastically. Do they see that same trend in women astronauts when they're up there? Do they see a greater decrease in bone density over time, or is it basically the same?
That's a good question. I don't think so, because the women astronauts are usually in their 30s or 40s or 50s. They're not, osteoporosis age. And the women who fly in space are all exercising, they even do weightlifting. So I have never heard that as being an issue. There are some issues where, male or female have different responses to the thing, but I have not heard that particular one.
What is the you mentioned vitamin supplement? What is I guess the food program? What is your nutrient program? What is it like, the entirety of it?
It's pretty good. I when I was in space, I enjoyed the food. It was one of the highlights of my time up there. I like variety. The American food was good. It's not. We didn't have fish. I wanted more fish. There's very little of that. There were like bags of tuna and shrimp cocktail. Those were the only really fish that we had. The Russians had great fish. That was one of the highlights of theirs. So you could ask for different. There was a standard program of mostly American food, but you could ask for food packets. So I actually ordered some Russian food because I really like their borscht, and their mashed potatoes were really good. And I wanted European, but they had run out of food. So they gave me like some leftover old European food, but it was like duck confit, and it was all this fancy French chef food. It was really good. It was all expired, but it tasted pretty good. So.
What was, I guess a question I'd want to ask when you return, is there like a program, or I guess, I scuba dive, right? And there's obviously the issues there with the pressure on you, and you have to, there's the precautions you have to take. I'm sure it's kind of not the same, but almost an opposite thing coming back. What do you have to do coming back? Is there a program you have to go through?
Yeah, so the space station is at sea level pressure. It's, I don't know, 14.2, 14.3 PSI or something like that. And standard sea level pressure, I think, is 14.7. So it's pretty close. So actually coming back to Earth is not a problem unless you have a leak in your spaceship. In that case, your suit would fill up like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. And you may, and if you leaked a vacuum, you might end up getting the bends, because the pressure in your suit, you would have a pressure drop. The big time that we face that is not coming back to Earth, is actually going out and doing a spacewalk, because the big bulky, I've got my book right there, How to Astronaut. There's a picture of me in a spacesuit there. That spacesuit right there, or I got my little Omega watch, astronaut in the spacesuit, right? Yeah. That spacesuit is only about 1/3 atmospheric pressure. So you actually have to take a couple hours. You breathe 100% oxygen to get the nitrogen out of your blood.
Yes,
and they step down the pressure. There's different ways to do it. You can spend the night in the airlock at a reduced pressure, or you can just do it all at once, which is what I did. But that step down from sea level pressure to 1/3 pressure is important, because you would get the bends, which is when this gas inside your body comes out and it hurts your bones, and it can kill you. It can get in your brain or your lungs or whatever. And
it can give you an aneurysm.
It can be really bad.
Okay.
Yeah.
One quick question I wanted to ask too. I looked at when you graduated. You must have been around 18 or 19 years old when the Challenger explosion happened. Am I right about that?
You are. Mm-hmm.
What I was in
Yeah,
elementary
I was-
school, and I remember it clearly. I mean, Justin probably does as well. I mean, it was a monumental moment in U.S. history. I mean, is there we haven't had anything like that since. Is there any chance, have we fixed that problem of ever happening again? I mean, is there what are the risks of that anymore?
Well, we had the Space Shuttle Columbia blew up in 2003, so we
Yeah.
did have it again. In fact, I teach that class at Harvard Business School. It's called Why Organizations Fail, and we talk about Challenger and Columbia. And I've written some other things about it. Essentially, they were the same. They were the same exact organizational failure, which is really frustrating for me. And SpaceX has had some challenges. They've been great. They've launched crews into space. It's everybody loves SpaceX, but they've also had a few test capsules without people on board blow up and crash, and you never hear about those things. So the good news is space travel is hard. They have their failure, they fix it, they move on quickly, which is what you need to do. But there's still risk there for sure. Anytime you're strapping yourself to a rocket going into space, there's risk. There's a space tourist company called Virgin Galactic, and they're just taking people up on a rocket plane, and they come right back down a few minutes later. But that last launch that they had some issues. They did not fly the trajectory they wanted to fly, and that's why they haven't flown since then. They've been dealing with the fallout from that. So there's still risk.
It's interesting that you bring up, Columbia and Challenger, and the fact that there were essentially the same failures creating that, and the frustration you had around that. And I think it's important for our listeners to hear, which are mainly, not industries like NASA, that an organization like NASA that we think of as being just unbelievably gifted at that kind of stuff can still have an event that happened when I was in fourth grade, and then another event that happened when I was in my adulthood, essentially be the same thing. And then you think about all of the launches that were in between that, then nothing happened. And this sense of maybe complacency or something that maybe we fixed the problem, it's not going to happen again. And that can affect any organization of any caliber, any size. I think that's important, an important point you brought up.
Yeah, it's I do consulting, I do speaking on this topic. The financial industry is, perhaps the most prone to risk. Oil and gas industry. My son was studying chemical engineering, and he did the Texas city explosion.
Yeah.
And reading that, I thought I was reading the Challenger accident report. To say that nothing happened and then all of a sudden Columbia happened, that's not true. As an Air Force pilot, we always study safety and aircraft accidents. Airplanes never just crash. There's always a chain of events. We call it the safety chain. So the key is to you have to break one of those links so that it doesn't keep on until the accident happens.
Right.
Rockets, nothing very rarely just suddenly explodes and kills people. There's always warning signs. The vehicle's almost always talking to you. The Columbia accident happened from foam hitting the wing of the space shuttle that popped a hole in it, and then it melted when it came back to Earth and hit that really hot re-entry temperatures. They had foam coming off the shuttle and hitting different parts and really serious damage. And they always said, well, it didn't kill him, it must be fine. Well, that's the wrong answer. If the vehicle's talking to you, and Challenger, they had the O-ring leaking hot gas on several missions. It just didn't leak it towards the tank. And so if it goes out into space, nothing happens. But on Challenger, it went right towards the fuel tank. It was a blowtorch on rocket fuel, which eventually blew up. And so when the vehicle's talking to you, you got to listen. And that's the hard thing for managers to figure out. If you want to be safe, you would just never fly.
Sure.
That doesn't make sense, but you have to come up with that balance.
Yeah. And I think that point is equally important in that when I said, all these launches where nothing happened, to the public watching, there's nothing happening.
Right.
Right. And so how many times do companies see that too, where you're seeing all of these, the vehicles talking to you, so to speak, your organization's talking to you, and the outside of that group, maybe even inside the organization, they don't see any of that conversation between your vehicle and you, and none of that gets communicated out, and you ultimately end up with the same result. So I think it's a really interesting topic. You could spend hours just debating all of that, I think. So it's pretty interesting to me for sure.
A quick answer on this one. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but it's something that interests me, Terry. How big of a problem is space junk? Is it really? Is it a danger to people on Earth?
People on Earth, not so much, unless when the space station comes back, that's going to hit the ground for sure. At least a lot of it will. But the big problem with space junk is it makes it dangerous for stuff in space. And so I've actually had several guests on my podcast, Down to Earth with Terry Virts, who have talked about that very thing. I think it's the biggest problem that we're not talking about today. It's one of the big. It's on the Mount Rushmore problems because the space junk that we're putting up in these large constellations, Starlink, OneWeb, the Chinese have them. They're launching tens of thousands of satellites at pretty high altitude, which means they're never going to come back to Earth. There's not enough atmospheric drag to slow them down and bring them back to Earth. And some of them, if they function properly, will fly themselves back and burn up. But a lot of them are not going to function properly, and so we're just making these massive clouds of debris. And space is big; there's lots of room, but it's not infinite. And there's been a couple of incidents where defunct, dead satellites have run into other satellites, and they create bigger debris. And there's a chance that's not zero for sure that we're just going to make this huge cloud of debris to make large parts of Earth orbit not usable because of all the mess we made. And the mess we're making there will be around forever. People in the year 2500 are going to be on podcasts bad-mouthing us because of how we made this mess that's not, clean upable.
It sure doesn't help when countries are blowing satellites and stuff up just to prove they can do it either.
So when I was in space in 2007, I had to maneuver the space station to avoid debris that our Chinese friends made. In 2014, I had to avoid debris. I'm sorry. I was in space in 2015. The debris happened in 2007. So 8 years later, I had to maneuver the ISS in 2015 because of this Chinese military test. Then in 2019, our Indian friends decided they needed to get into it, and they blew up a satellite a couple hundred miles up. And then just a few months ago, Russia did something that it should have been a glaring red flag. They blew up a satellite at the same orbit as the space station, and our astronauts and their cosmonauts had to jump in a Soyuz and because they didn't know if we were going to hit the debris or not. And when you're going to have what they call a conjunction, which means this piece of debris is going to come really close to the space station.
A fancy way of saying a wreck.
And you don't know if you're going to have a wreck or not, but you have to get in your Soyuz and close the hatch. The theory being if it rips through the space station, it would be such a disaster. At least you'll be in your capsule and be safe in there. Now, it could hit the capsule too.
Correct.
I mean, hopefully it won't. The capsule's smaller, but it's zooming through space at 5 kilometers a second. You're going 5 kilometers a second in a different direction. It's a mess.
Pretty good closing speed.
Yes.
I want to move on to Mars, Terry. That's obviously a big in the news and the general public is something that's captivated. Obviously, Elon Musk and SpaceX is on a mission to get there. I've heard you speak quite a bit about this and the idea of if traveling there if it is impossible, if terraform is possible. What are your opinions? Are we really going to get there? Are we really going to put people on the surface there? And is terraform people actually settling there possible?
Yeah. Actually, so I have this new book, How to Astronaut. There's a chapter in there about that, and I wrote about the technologies that I think we need. The first most important technology is nuclear power because nuclear power gives us megawatts. Solar power gives us kilowatts, and you need megawatts to drive an electric propulsion system. So instead of a normal rocket engine where you burn fuel, you electrify ions and you shoot them out the back, and that actually makes thrust, and you can go a lot faster if you have engines like that. A lot of satellites in Earth orbit use really small versions of that. In order to send people, you need a massive nuclear engine. Once you get to the surface, you need nuclear power because people just need electricity to run the fans, to run the atmosphere system, the water system. The heaters, it's cold on Mars. So people need electricity. So nuclear power in space is number one. Number two, those engines would help get us there and back quicker. You could go to Mars and back in a year if you had the right kind of electric propulsion. If you just have a normal chemical rocket, the kind that we use every day, it's a 3-year trip because it takes you so long to get there. Earth and Mars go around the sun, and you got to wait for them to go around the sun again to line up to come back. And so the difference between 3 years and 1 year is huge. That's a lot of food and underwear and toilet paper you got to pack. It's also a lot of radiation.
Well, that seems to me to be the problem I couldn't come together in my head is if it's a 3-year journey, how do you solve the food problem? I don't understand how they would do that.
You have to pack a lot of food. One of the guys here, one of the Johnson Space Center, actual rocket scientists. Most people here are not. They kind of have normal jobs, but this guy actually develops missions and he understands this stuff. And this has been a few years since we talked, but he said that it would require between 7 and 9 SLS launches. SLS is this giant, massive NASA rocket that we've been developing for 17 years now, and it hasn't flown yet. And we're going to potentially fly it like once a year. And he said it would take 7 of these launches to build the massive 3-year Mars ship to get there and back in a 3-year trip. So that's just not practical, which is another reason why the 1-year mission is and the dollars, to send stuff to the space station, it's tens of thousands of dollars, even on SpaceX. Everybody says how cheap SpaceX is. They just raised their prices by 50%. It's good. It's good to have a monopoly, by the way. And so
it never hurt. It doesn't hurt.
Yeah. It's not exactly a monopoly, but it's pretty close.
It's close.
It's tens of thousands. I've got my McDonald's Diet Coke here. This would be tens of thousands of dollars to launch to the space station. To launch it to the moon, it would be hundreds of thousands of dollars, especially to bring it back. And to go to Mars, it's probably going to be $1 million. Mm-hmm. If you go on Wikipedia and you divide the mission cost by how many kilograms we send to Mars, that's not a scientific way of doing it, but it's pretty close. It's going to be about $1 million a kilogram to get something there and back. So the less food and stuff you have to pack, the more economically viable it is to go to Mars. You asked about terraforming.
Yeah. Well, before that, let me ask you this. To get there in a year, how fast are we going? I mean, how fast will the ship have to go?
Well, to leave Earth's gravity, it's got to go 25,000 miles an hour with respect to Earth. But whenever you're talking about speeds in space, you have to ask with respect to what? With respect to the sun, with respect to Earth, because Earth's going tens of thousands of miles an hour around the sun. The sun's going hundreds of thousands of miles an hour around the galaxy. So everything's moving relative to something else. But with respect to Earth, you need to get going probably, 30, 40, maybe not 50, probably 30 to 40,000 miles an hour. It's pretty fast.
And how would that, how would that be handled? How would the body handle that though? I mean, is it just decompressing like something inside the cockpit there, or?
Well, getting off of Earth, the shuttle and the Soyuz, the shuttle went to 3 Gs. I think the Soyuz goes up to about 4 Gs. So it's 3 or 4 times your body weight. So lay on your back and have a couple of your buddies lay on top of you. That's what it feels like. And that's for 8 minutes, 8.5 minutes just to get into Earth orbit. To go to Mars, the acceleration wouldn't be that much, but if you use a rocket, it would be 1 or 2 Gs of acceleration, which is a lot. If you use electric propulsion, it's a fraction of a G. You would barely feel it. The difference is the chemical rocket burns for 8 minutes. The electric motor would run the entire time. It would run for 3 months. It would be accelerating you, pointing you towards Mars. And then halfway there, you would spin around and it would decelerate you. So you don't go flying past. So the electric propulsion is really low force, but it's continuous acceleration. And you end up going a lot faster. Imagine if you had a car floating, so there was no friction. Well, if you just push on it with your finger, you're not going to win any drag races. But if you pushed on it with your finger for a month, that thing would be going pretty fast at the end of the month.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and then once you're up to speed, you're going to be assimilated to that inside anyway. You're not.
You're floating.
Yeah, you're just floating. So, and plus with the expense going to Mars, you've got to factor in Matt Damon's expenses as well, and all of that, right?
Hair and makeup is as you guys running a podcast, as you guys know, that's a big.
And he's probably got a massive salary. I mean, I just assume, but anyhow.
So terraform
bigger than mine.
Is it possible on Mars or anywhere for that matter?
Yeah. So basically, like making something like Earth is the Latin term, and it's possible, but it wouldn't last for one very simple reason. Mars doesn't have a magnetic field. I just did a series of podcasts with a guy named Jim Head from Brown University. He's really cool astronomy professor there. He's the best. Worked with our Apollo astronauts back in the day. He's teaching kids at Brown. And we did a series, I think it was 4 episodes. We started off at Mercury and went all the way out to Pluto and the Kuiper Belt and Oort cloud. all the different planets. And the bottom line with Mars is there's no magnetic field. So even if we made an atmosphere there, the solar wind would just strip it away. The reason why Mars used to have an atmosphere, it doesn't anymore because there's no magnetic field. Unless you have a magnetic field to protect you from solar radiation, you will lose your atmosphere. The other problem is there's water on Mars and there's carbon dioxide. You can see the ice. If you got a small telescope, if it's the Martian winter or summer, you can see the polar ice caps at the North Pole and South Pole. So there is water there that you can see from your backyard, but it's frozen. It's like minus 150 degrees, or it's really cold in the Martian polar ice caps. And I think Elon Musk his idea was, well, we could just set off nuclear bombs in the Martian polar ice caps that would heat up all this water, and it would make an atmosphere. It would make an atmosphere for some amount of time, but eventually the solar wind would strip it away. So at the end of the day, you can never terraform Mars for the long term, unless you can start the planet's core spinning. And I don't think we're going to be able to do that anytime soon. So that's a really long answer. The bottom line is we got Earth, and that's it. There is no planet B.
Yeah, I actually just listened to an interview that Bill Maher did with Ben Shapiro, and they were talking about going to Mars. And Bill Maher's point was, you have to create everything on Mars to be sustainable and livable. Earth would have to get. He can't imagine a scenario where Earth was so bad that was the answer, right? So.
If Earth is so bad that Mars is the answer, we're in bad. Yeah,
it's over.
We're in bad shape.
Correct.
Yeah. You kind of touched on it earlier. Does the idea of militarizing space scare you? I mean, obviously, Justin mentioned Space Force is something that came along recently. The idea of a moon base, and in the past, I guess in the beginnings of space, it was almost like it was a competition, right? And it was also a sign of power, like who got there first and who was in charge and who was really the big dog in the world, right? Now it's getting to the point where it seems like satellites are becoming weapons. You've mentioned and something I had never heard, the Russian explosion just a few months ago. Is space becoming militarized? And if it is, does that concern you?
Space got militarized back in the 60s. We've had a Space Force since the 1960s. It used to be called Air Force Space Command. Now it's Space Force. It's the same people. They just got a different uniform. And they also integrated a little bit of Navy, and some of the other services had their own little mini Space Forces. So there was some efficiency there. I actually wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post a few years ago advocating for that. And I was standing 10 feet in front of President Trump the day he announced that there was going to be a space. I didn't know it. I was there to talk about our moon exploration program, but I was right in front of him when he announced there was going to be a Space Force. So I have this connection with it. The reality is space is not air. I've done them both, and they're both very different. It's not land, it's not water, and it's not cyber. And the way our military fights is multi-domain. We don't just send the infantry in. We send in multi-domain. We have air, land, sea power, and space power, and cyber power. So in my mind, we should also have a cyber force, because each service has their own cyber commands. I spent a little bit of time in Air Force Cyber Command. The kind of guys that grow up to be hackers are not the kind of guys that grow up to be fighter pilots. And they're not the kind of guys that grow up to be infantrymen. And they're not the kind of guys that grow up to be sailors, right? It's just a different type of person. So I think we should have a cyber force. I think we should have a space force. I don't think that we should be overtly, putting weapons in space and that kind of thing. What we really need to focus on is preserving our assets, because our assets in space allow us to fight the way we fight. This war in Russia, Maxor is a private company that's been providing intelligence for the world. That convoy around Kiev should have been destroyed on day one. Unfortunately, the Ukrainians don't have the weapons to do that. We should have given them the weapons so that they could have destroyed that thing. This theater that the Russians just bombed, that they had the word "deti," which means children in Russian. You could see that from space. Starlinks, a friend of mine just bought a Starlink terminal and shipped it over, and it's providing intelligence to Ukrainian forces. That comes from space, right? Lots and lots of our warfighting capability comes from space, and other nations are much less dependent on space. So there's this concept of asymmetric warfare where a less sophisticated country could just poke us in the eye and take out our space assets. There's some speculation about why did Putin do that military test a few months ago. I don't know that that's why he was doing it, but it would be a much lower cost to a country like Russia than it would be to a country like us to just start blowing up satellites in Earth orbit. So protecting our assets, I think, is maybe one of our top priorities. I'm not in Space Force, so I can't say. This is just as a civilian, it's talking off the top of my head.
I think it's interesting you bring up the cost to Putin and countries like that to make a statement or whatever is much less than the cost of the U.S. And it's the same when you discuss environmental impacts and those types of things. And we do everything we can over here to always be greener and make the right decisions around the planet. And it's you can only do so much as a country. And I think that's a great point to bring up, that the impact to us is much greater than the impact to a China or a Russia, because they not that they don't care, but they just seemingly don't care, right? They just like, we're going to do this, and it's just the way that we're going to do it. And I, to your point, like when the theater that they bombed yesterday, and that was horrific to see and all of that, and you're just like, okay, well, this is a different kind of warfare than we haven't seen this since really World War II type of warfare, and it's really, really sad to see.
Unfortunately, we saw it 5 years ago when Russia went in and annihilated Syria to prop up the dictator Assad, and we saw it in Chechnya and Georgia, and they've done this several times. When you talk about asymmetric warfare, we've seen it in Afghanistan for the last 20 years. A caveman can come out, build an IED, and take out American forces, and it costs them very little, and it costs us a lot. In Iraq, we would be bombing $10,000 trucks with $1 million bombs, and so there's
I think the
there's
point
a lot of asymmetry.
Yeah, absolutely. The point I was making is we tend to make decisions based on wanting to appear a certain way on the world stage, and it doesn't seem as important to those other countries. That was the point I was making.
Russia's not worried about the world stage at all, because they have their own propaganda, and their people many of them have been brainwashed. It's really heartbreaking talking to really good Russian friends, and some of them have just been brainwashed, and they believe the propaganda, and it's hurting them. It's killing their own soldiers, and it's their lives are going to be miserable for many years to come because of one man's ego. And propaganda is not just limited to Russia. We have plenty of disinformation here too. I think of all the problems we face, I think that's actually the biggest one, is just having people think clear-minded and about things, and not be blinded by ideology or propaganda or whatever you want to call it.
Provocateurs. Yep. So moving along here, you're doing a lot of media. You've got your podcast, you've got your books, you even have a photography book as well that you did while you were in space. And what you're doing, is inspiring young people. You're teaching young people. You're bringing this to them in a ways that we couldn't see it as young children, right? On the internet and on phones and such great pictures. So in the spirit of that, I asked online for questions. Mostly for children, some from adults that just wanted to ask questions as well. And I'll start that off, because some of these questions are certainly going to be questions that adults would want to know the answer to as well, right? And so I'll start it off. So the first question is from Sharino Mariana. She's 8 years old. She wants to know, what are you doing while you were in space?
Well, the fun thing about being in space is that every day it's something different. You don't do the same thing ever. Some days you're doing experiments. Every day you have to exercise. Some days you're doing interviews. Some days there's cargo ships that come up and you have to unpack them and you have to reload them when they go back to Earth. Some days you do spacewalks. So every day there was something different, which I really enjoy.
Okay. All right. Second question is from Charlie Townsend. She's 10 years old. She wants to know, what does it feel like to walk on the moon / in space? And I know you didn't walk on the moon, but you may have an
Yeah.
answer for that, though.
We have this airplane, we call it the vomit comet. It's like an
Oh,
airliner,
yeah.
and it goes up and it pushes over. And so you can get weightless, or if the pilot pushes over not quite as hard, just a little bit less, you can actually feel what it's like on the moon. So we would do a bunch of weightless parabolas, we call them, and then they would do one for Mars and one for the moon. And that was always really fun. But it feels like you're falling. And the reason it feels like you're falling is because that's what's happening. You're falling. Like I talked about before, you're just falling towards Earth. There's still gravity. There really is not zero gravity anywhere. You're just moving so far ahead as you fall. Every second you move 5 miles forward, and you fall and you move 5 miles forward. And so that falling and moving makes an orbit. If you're at the exact right speed, it makes the shape of an orbit, which is the same shape as Earth. So it feels like you're falling is what that feels like.
Yeah, I found it interesting. You described it as having to consciously keep from like waving your arms around,
Yeah.
and just in your mind say, okay, you're falling, but you're not falling. You're fine.
Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting. I like trying to even process what that would feel like over
Yeah.
an extended duration was kind of.
Right.
I still am not quite there, but it's pretty interesting.
That it's interesting. I don't know why the humans. Why do we have that instinct of?
Well, we think we can fly. I guess I don't know.
Maybe it's some type of we're trying to be birds. Maybe so.
Who knows?
That's so interesting.
It is an interesting response to a fall, though, for sure.
Yeah. You should do this or something to protect the fall, but that's not what we do.
Still the cuss words, though, but definitely not trying to flap the arms.
So next question from Spencer Townsend. She's 7 years old. She wants to know, does it feel like the scariest roller coaster ever when you take off?
It was even more than that. You can't even imagine. It's the scariest roller coaster inside of the craziest car driver that's ever driven down the highway, inside of the craziest pilot flying through a thunderstorm.
And worth
it. The sound is so loud. The rocket engines are so loud. You're smashed back because there's so many G forces from the rocket. On the shuttle, there was a lot of vibration, so it's like somebody grabbing you and shaking you. It's really cool, but it's a really crazy ride into space.
And while all that's going on, are there people from mission control in your earphone telling you all kinds of stuff, or is it pretty quiet while you're ascending?
No. I mean, well, first of all, you try to minimize comm because whenever somebody's talking, everybody else has to shut up. And so one of the first things you learn as a pilot, you don't say something unless it's useful, because every time you're talking, someone else can't talk. So that's not too much, but there is some comm back and forth.
Justin, why don't you go ahead and ask yours?
Yep. So my question is from Myers, who's 15 years old. He says, is the Air Force the best path, or at least a very good path, towards becoming an astronaut? And is there a certain focus that they should have in college for a major that would make it helpful to becoming an astronaut?
Great question.
I'm a little bit biased. I think the Air Force is the best. There's a lot of ways to other military services. There's civilian scientists and engineers and doctors. Having a technical degree like a math or science or engineering degree is necessary. That's one of the requirements for NASA. So you have to go to college, you have to get that degree, but you need a lot more than that. There's thousands or tens of thousands of applications they get. So you want to do well, you have to be at the top of your game in whatever career you're in, and probably having advanced education. So if you want to be an astronaut, you're going to be learning for the rest of your life. I'm still learning. I'm reading a book about how to write a screenplay right now. I'm learning all kinds of stuff about the energy industry. So you just have to have that curiosity for learning for life is the most important thing.
Great.
All right. Next question is from Bailey Hieronymus. Surprising question here for a 10-year-old, but her question is, after Mars, what is the next goal for space exploration? Which I thought was a wild question from a 10-year-old, but
yeah, she needs to listen to my podcast with Jim Head. I just had a whole discussion about outer planets, and I actually had a couple of other astronomers on talking about the outer planets. Those moons out there around Jupiter and Saturn and the big giants, the big 4 planets, are so cool. There's some really neat places out there. Titan is this world with this really thick atmosphere. There's liquid oceans there. There's lakes of methane, I think. There's just crazy stuff on Titan. Europa is one of the two places that might have life. There's a liquid ocean on Europa. It's covered with an ice covering, so that would be really cool to go to. It's an ice moon. Enceladus is another moon of Saturn that would be pretty cool. So all of those places would be pretty awesome. Io is one of the moons of Jupiter. You can see it with binoculars if you got binoculars, and it's really volcanic. When Voyager flew by it back in 40 years ago now, over 40 years ago, I remember seeing pictures of volcanoes erupting on Io, which is just amazing. The reason is it's really close to Jupiter, so Jupiter's gravity like squashes the planet, which keeps it really hot, and it launches. But there are some ice volcanoes on some of those moons that actually shoot up water because there's so much water there. There's literally volcanoes of ice erupting. It's just really cool. There's some neat places to go visit.
All right. Great answer. Hayden De La Garza, he's 14. He also knows the food good.
The food is pretty good. Like I said, we got pretty good food lab here at the Johnson Space Center. They did a good job. I enjoyed eating for 200 days, so it was good food.
Good. Okay, Zach Kahn, he's a student at Georgia Tech, so his question obviously going to be a little bit more higher end on the questions. Despite the rigorous training, did anything surprise you in your trip into space?
I was surprised at how beautiful the planet was. It was just so awesome. I couldn't take my eye off of it, but I was flying the shuttle, so I'm like, oh my God, I just want to look out the window, but I've got to fly Endeavor, you know? Yeah. So it was really distracting at times. And I had my whole 7 months in space where I'm seeing the most amazing, I'm seeing creation from God's point of view. And then I have to get back to work on the toilet or plug in the cable or whatever, you know? So it's really a really wild, I call it juxtaposition of sublime and mundane, where you go from, this is incredible, to you're doing basic mechanic work.
And I guess that probably leads to a good one here. Micah Koshi, he wants to know, what was your most memorable moment in space? Can you hear me?
Okay. I can. Yeah, I'm thinking. There was a.
Sorry.
I was on a spacewalk one time, plugging in cables. Literally, I routed the power and data cables that SpaceX uses when it docks, and I had a few seconds, and I stopped and I kind of rotated myself around, and I could see the sunrise. I could see that happening.
Yeah.
From one side of the earth to the other. And it was like I was hearing from God, like I was seeing creation, something that humans weren't meant to see. And then I had to get back to work because I had to plug in the next cable. So it was a very memorable moment.
Okay. Final question here. This is, actually two more. One more from Zach. He would want to know, if you could solve one problem with space travel, what would it be?
Electric propulsion.
Yeah, you mentioned that earlier. I figured that was going to be the answer.
Help us. That's how you get around the solar system.
Okay. And actually, his father is my mentor, Bush Khan, and he has a question as well. He's here in Houston. I hope to introduce you to him someday. He owns Alchemy Industrial. Yeah. And so he would like to know, what do you think of the private space industry in space, the private space industry, I guess, and how they might work with government programs?
Well, back in 2005, our then administrator, Mike Griffin, started a program it was called COTS, Commercial Off the Shelf, I think, but it was a way to try and get a little bit of government money into some private companies to do cargo delivery to the space station. It was really just a way to get money into these private companies that were trying to do things. And he actually saved a company from bankruptcy. They were literally like one failure away from completely going under. And that company was SpaceX. And then a few years later, they were delivering cargo to the space station. We also started a big government rocket program called SLS that same year, and it hasn't flown yet. And it's billions of dollars a year that we've been spending ever since then. So you can see what private industry's done, and you can see what government's done. private industry generally does better than the government at things like innovation and manufacturing and that kind of thing. So I think it's really good. The public-private partnership is a key to what NASA is doing and what we want to do in the future. There's a lot of different aspects of private spaceflight. I mean, there's launch, which is SpaceX, maybe Blue Origin in the future. Blue Origin's been really slow. That's Jeff Bezos's company. I think when they catch up, I think they're going to be this big dog, but they have not really launched much at all. They've been very slow. SpaceX has been way out in front of everybody else. And the things that these companies are doing are the envy of the world. The Russian space agency does not have any of that. Their space program is completely destroyed now. Thanks to this war in Ukraine, all the commercial customers they had have pulled off the Soyuz. They're going to move to SpaceX or European Ariane rockets or other rockets. They have just destroyed their company. So the private guys give us a lot of innovation. They, I think, are going to enable future exploration, like back to the moon. You know, these things with the billionaires going up and stuff. It doesn't excite me that much. It was cool to see Captain Kirk go up, you know, watching.
Yeah, that was cool.
I had a big smile on my face. I was really happy for William Shatner. But if a hedge fund manager gets to take his kid into space, that's fine. But that money that he's spending is providing the middle class salaries for all the engineers that build the rocket. And Blue Origin doesn't just want to send tourists into space. They actually want to send, you know, have much bigger rockets that are going to have much more serious payloads and that kind of thing. So the billionaires in space actually help finance the other more important things that we're trying to do in space.
Yeah, and we've actually on this podcast, we've had another person on here that had ties to the space station, Kent Harrington, who was with a company called Tynovix, which it works with NASA. They provide the HoloLens units and all the procedural stuff that that you guys used in the space station. So he and I are friends, and we had him on the podcast. So it's kind of interesting. We've had a couple of connections to the space station now.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And this is the final question, Terry, and this comes from Jeff Peoples.
Heard of him.
Here it goes. Are aliens real? Do we have aliens?
You got to read my book. I got a chapter about that.
Well,
I have an astronaut. So I have a chapter about that. So here's the deal. I never saw any, but I've had a couple of alien guys on my podcast. Those are by far the most popular podcasts I've done. You'd think there's so many planets out there. You'd think there are aliens. I mean, there's billions of planets. But then again, I think life is so complicated. I don't think it would just start on its own. I think it needs somebody to get things going. And I say that from a scientific point of view, not a religious point of view. It's just a human eyeball is infinitely more complicated than my Omega watch, right? And so, A, you think somebody would have to get it started. B, there's a lot of planets, so you think they're out there. But C, man, those planets are really, 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 really far away. So even if they're out there, it's going to be tough to hear from them. But then again, you see these. I had Chris Mellon, the former Undersecretary of Defense, who got these videos released of what the Navy guys have been seeing. I don't know what those things are. And from what I've heard, I never saw them firsthand, but it sounds like they're doing things that defy physics. So I don't know what those things were.
Well, what about that you covered that one thing up when you were on your spacewalk?
Yeah, that's right. You saw the video. Yeah. That cracks me up. Like there's a YouTube video of, and there Terry Virts is blocking the view of because obviously there's only one camera on the space station.
That's right. It's only the one that you covered up. Well done.
Even though there's two on my helmet.
Right. That's right.
And then there's 100 other ones that are looking. But there was like some glint of something right as my hand moved in front of it. And
right. And you're so aware of that in everything you're doing at a spacewalk. You went, oh, wait, let me get that.
And I knew I went, okay, the line of sight from that thing to this camera up there is right there. It's not there. And it's not in front of my face. It's over here. I knew
you are a fighter. You're a fighter pilot. So you are good at that kind of stuff. So
ninja skills.
That's right.
Wow. Well, I was going to ask you about that one singular event, and I guess people, the layman person looking at that video, they're seeing what's on screen off the actual plane itself, right? That's the radar they're seeing. You've read radars like that before. You saw that. Was anything about that explainable to you? And I guess the physics as we know it.
Which event are you talking about?
The ones that was just released a couple of months ago.
The Navy pilot videos. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it wasn't a radar. That was an infrared camera.
Mm-hmm.
We had the same infrared camera on the F-16. It lets you see at night.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a targeting pod that was just tracking this thing. It looks like they call it a tic tac. It's kind of shaped like a cylinder. And if you listen to their eyewitness testimony, and the guys that are testifying are fighter pilots. When they wake up in the morning, their goal for the day is to not see an alien. Like these are not
exactly.
That's furthest from their mind.
They're not in the UFO club.
Yeah,
right.
And if you report it, you're the UFO guy. And there's been Air Force. I know Air Force guys have seen these too, but they don't want to report them because the culture in the Air Force is not conducive to being the UFO guy. Right. So
you'll get a pretty fancy call sign.
This is not what you want to do. And so
correct.
The good news is there's data. There's an infrared tracking camera. There are radar tracks of these things. The DoD may have more. I don't know what the DoD has. I was never a part of this program, but I would love to see that data. And people who have seen it and have talked about it have said this thing went from the water to space and really fast. And so who knows what that was. Chris's theory was it was there's some type of drones kind of monitoring us, but I don't know if that's real or not. I have no idea. All I know is that I saw the videos, I heard the interviews, the people sound credible, the tracking data sounds credible. And people, and there's not a stigma anymore. They don't call them UFOs, they're UAPs. They're trying to destigmatize, let's actually look at it. I had one guy on my podcast and it was going really well. It was interesting. And then he started talking about smoking mushrooms and when he was smoking mushroom. And I'm like, dude, we got to cut. YouTube's not going to let me put that on there. So we had to cut that part out. And I'm like, all right, then yes, my immediate instinct is to go and scientists say this too. Astronomers say this. The first instinct is it's not aliens, whatever it is you're seeing. If you're seeing some chemical trace in an atmosphere, if you got a radio signal coming in, if you got a video of a thing, your first instinct needs to be it's not aliens. Carl Sagan said extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So, to prove this is aliens would require a lot of proof before people are going to believe it. But there's some level of I don't know what that is. It doesn't really make sense from what I've seen.
I guess my greatest question. Go ahead, Justin. Go ahead.
I was going to say it's getting so much traction now because there are credible people saying that, like a fighter pilot is saying that it's not some guy in Georgia. Sorry. That's saying it. It's a fighter pilot. And you're like, well, to your point, these guys, number one, their culture internally is you don't want to make a mistake and you don't want to be that guy.
You don't want to be that guy.
No. And then beyond that, they don't wake up looking for those things. So I think that's why it's getting as much traction as it is.
Yeah, it's interesting. Although based on events, I used to kind of make fun of our former president, but now stuff's going on Earth. Like if I was an alien, I think I might just keep on going by and look for another planet somewhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's
but
Terry, who knows?
Looking at the life you've lived, it's an enviable life for most men. It's almost like a fairy tale. And look, you worked yourself into that, and you've done the things you wanted to do, and you've got almost seems like an almost impossible amount of things going on right now. And some of the things that obviously we're trying to do here, is media stuff, and I appreciate the fact that you became an ambassador for the space exploration programs and things like that. And you're inspiring young people. What does your future look like besides the things you got going on currently? I know Justin was very interested in your renewable energy, which obviously is an interest to our podcast. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe anything else you got going on in the future?
In my perfect world, I would get, my business started, grow that to be successful, and use that to make movies. I'm really fascinated by that. I had a chance to direct my first film a couple years ago. I've written a few things. I've actually have a screenplay that we're shopping right now. So I kind of have right brain and left brain desires, but getting the business going would be great. A, because it would support other things, and B, because we need energy, and this is like, it just feels like now's the time for what we're trying to do. So, yeah.
So speaking on that, specifically Endeavor Renewables. First of all, I'm pretty sure I know how you came up with the name of it.
But never with a U.
Yeah, well,
there you go.
Yeah, that's right. But anyhow, I read through some of the things on it, and it's really pretty interesting, the concept of renewable diesel, especially given fuel prices and things what they are, and if you could just kind of go through that and kind of, what is it about that was interesting enough to you to say, you know what, I'm going to get in the business of that?
Yeah, well, what we're doing is using cellulosic feedstock, so plant matter, crops. You can use wood also. We're using that waste to make diesel. It's the same process that Hitler used in World War II when we bombed his fuel supplies. He used biomass to make diesel because he needed diesel for his army. Our process is a lot better nowadays, but it's a really interesting business. We think eventually we're going to get it to where it doesn't need subsidies. Right now, the government is providing good subsidies. If they weren't, we wouldn't be doing it. So sometimes the government, it's a public-private partnership. They can be used to kind of, spark things along. We make some interesting byproducts too, a biochar that's a really interesting fertilizer, some water co-products that are, the water is really good for agricultural purposes, and also maybe we think as a concrete plasticizer. So this they call it circular economy, but there's a lot of multiple uses for this one technology. But at the end of the day, I would love to become a significant player in the renewable diesel universe.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I did not realize that the technology had been around since World War II. And I started reading it, and I would hope that the technology has improved since then. But it just, when I was reading through, just kind of preparing for getting to interview you and those types of things, and I saw that, I was like, man, that really kind of lines up well with some of the sustainability goals that companies are moving towards. And my question is it something that the renewable diesel side of it, is it something that has been around and people have been trying to monetize that, or is that relatively new space that you guys are tapping into?
Well, renewable diesel is huge right now. There's billions of dollars going into renewable diesel plant. That's called biodiesel. They use what's called fat oil and grease, or soybean oil. It's okay. It's not a great carbon. It's better carbon intensity than normal crude oil, but it's not as good as ours by a long shot. It doesn't have co-products that are interesting. But there's a lot of those products, and they're moving their diesel out west because the California and other states have really interesting subsidies. So we're going to focus on the Midwest and focus in this part of the country. But the electrification is great. And the reality is we're going to need diesel for a long time. 18-wheelers and trains use diesel fuel. It's a fuel that's just going to be required for a long time. And we can make it essentially carbon neutral. So, and it's American made, we're not depending on Russian or Venezuelan or Iranian oil. It's American made products.
Interesting. You chose those countries. Anything current that caused that?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. So, but there's a lot of misinformation. I recorded a monologue for my podcast today about energy prices, and there's a lot of emotional, oil companies are screwing us. Well, no, it's a global commodity, or this is all Biden's fault. Well, we should have built Keystone, but the reality is that wouldn't have changed things hardly at all. And so there's a lot of emotion and ideology, and we need just actual what's happening.
So I've been in oil and gas my entire life. I was born and raised in Midland, Texas. So that's all you get to do. And it's we've been an easy villain my entire life, and it's an easy we're an easy target. But at the same time, I think people don't quite understand that oil and gas aren't just gasoline that powers your car. It's literally almost every single thing that you touch. And to do away with it's just not exactly. It's just not something that you can do. And I always find it interesting, when they talk about, zero emissions. I remember listening to Elon Musk talk about it, and he said, well, it depends on where you count the emissions. If you count the emissions at the source, then maybe those are zero. But to get the hydrogen or whatever you're using as fuel to the point where it's usable to consume, there's a tremendous amount of emissions associated with that. And it's it to me is a pretty interesting concept. And I do think that there are things that we need to be doing and looking at ways to innovate and all of that. It just I just wish it wasn't all on the U.S. to figure it out, and it feels like it is. But it's great to see that there are companies out there like Endeavor that are looking at ways to make it still a fuel product that can run the equipment that's in place, but is a sustainable and a renewable source. And I wonder, you'd mentioned on one of the other interviews that I watched that when you were in space looking down on Earth, you realized just how connected everything is. It's just Earth, right? And we have, we sit here in Texas and we have, we think about it. When I think about Earth, I think about it in terms of a map, but you've seen Earth and does that help you? Do you think in your having seen that perspective, does that help you sort of guide those avenues of thought around, building a business for that type of thing?
I mean, I hope so. Looking back at Earth, there's only one. There's no planet B. I definitely had that realization. I also saw one of my most profound things was seeing city lights at night, and that you see people when you see city lights at night. You don't see people during the day. And the thought that I had that I'd never heard anybody say before, but what I was looking at was wealth, not population. And so you fly over places like Africa, there's no lights on. And it's dirt poor. You go over Western Europe or the East Coast of America, there's lots of lights on, lots of wealth. And those places need energy. They need a lot of things. They need political stability above all else. They need a malaria vaccine in Africa, but they also need energy, and it's energy that allows a lot of those other things to happen. So that one of the best ways to help life on Earth, the quality of life that people live, is to provide them with energy. The number one thing is to give them political stability. Once they have that, a functioning democracy or some form of it, then all the other things can come from it. And until you have that, it's really hard to get the other things to come. It's hard to get Ukrainians fired up about climate change right now.
Yeah, you would think so. Yeah, for sure. But that's the number one issue, though.
Yeah, that's the foundation of what's going on. And so the other thing, in my podcast this morning that I just recorded, and I've got an op-ed out that hopefully will get published in the next few days about energy. And so we need to be science-based. We can't spend a lot of money on energy that's not really helping us out. Like nuclear power is a great source of emission-free energy that we're just, for emotional reasons, we haven't pursued it. But we also have to think of our security. And in the 20th century, we had the biggest wealth transfer in human history from developed nations to the Middle East. And for the last 30 years, we've been paying American soldiers combat pay because of that, right? Like that was a disaster. The amount of dependency we had on countries that don't really like us, that didn't go well. And now we're moving into electrification, and America stopped making solar panels about a decade ago. China makes them all. Most windmill components are somehow made in China. Most of the rare earths and minerals that you need for batteries and battery components are made in China. So we're about to have the second largest wealth transfer in human history to support the Chinese Communist Party. And that's not going to work out well for us in the long run either. So we need to have a sane policy. Electrification is great. Let's make it in America or Mexico or Japan or Korea or even Vietnam. I mean, somewhere
friendly anyway.
Somewhere. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I find it interesting too. You mentioned some of the byproducts when you're working through the renewable diesel, and that one of the byproducts was water that helped with the, growing of plants, and then plants are used to create the sustainable, the diesel. And so is that cyclical nature something that's you guys are exploring as sort of?
100%. Absolutely. Yeah. The biochar is an incredible fertilizer. University of Tennessee has done a lot of tests on our biochar, and there's these little plants and these giant plants. And, basically what we're doing, we're doing the same thing. We're making crude oil. We're just doing it at 1100 degrees Celsius in a couple minutes, what takes nature millions of years. It's, we're taking plants we're taking energy from the sun, right? That's how plants make this chemistry. So the energy ultimately comes from the sun. And when we run it through our pyrolysis machine, what we're really doing is harnessing that energy from the sun that went into the plant. When you pump a barrel of crude oil, that's exactly what happened. It's only the earth took millions of years to do it. We're just expediting that process and down to a few minutes. But at the end of the day, the energy really comes from the sun and photosynthesis.
Right. That's cool.
Well, Terry, and I know you're a little bit, got a lot of things going on, and just kind of slow, close things up here. You live a life that's pretty enviable, and I know you're incredibly busy. So again, thank you for giving us your time, your knowledge, everything that all the information that you were able to share with us today was amazing. Where can our listeners go to learn more about the things you're doing?
I have a website, terryvirts.com. If they want to follow me on Twitter, I'm Astro Terry, Terry, and on Instagram, Astro_Terry. The Russians have hacked me several times. There's accounts like mine, so make sure you're on the verified. Make sure it's my account. They did it during the last election to promote a bunch of nonsense, and they just recently hacked me again a couple weeks ago. So make sure they go to the right Astro Terry, and then. Like I said, I got a couple books out, How to Astronaut. The documentary I made is called One More Orbit. So I've made a few projects. So you can find those on my website.
And what was your podcast name again?
The podcast. That's right. Down to Earth with Terry Virts.
Down to Earth with Terry Virts.
And that's been a lot of fun. I've been doing once a week for almost a year now. We talk about aliens. We talk about space. We talk about politics. We talk about filmmaking. I've had some Academy Award winners on. It's a totally random. My brain is very random and ADD, so it follows my brain's ADD pattern. But it's been fun. I had Washington Post bestseller on, who wrote the book called The Afghanistan Papers. Had a Navy SEAL on. Just all different kinds of people.
Well, we appreciate you. We really appreciate you doing this, moving up. You moved up a little bit from Joe Rogan to our show, so
exactly. Yeah,
good for you. But well, thank you very much, sir, and good luck in everything that you do. And we look forward to keeping up with you and maybe doing this again maybe in the near future one day.
Yeah, thank you guys. This is great. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Terry.
Guns up.
Guns up.
Yeah, exactly, man.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show and accept the mission. Please subscribe to the Mission Zero podcast on your preferred streaming service and be sure to give us a 5-star review.